Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. And I just wanted to start by giving a little bit of an update on my health. It's hard to believe that basically a month ago, December 10th, I went in for surgery to have a cancerous tumor removed from the side of my neck. And during that surgery, actually, my surgeon ended up taking out 30 of my lymph nodes. And 13 of them ended up being cancerous, which was way more than I thought going in. And for those of you wondering, apparently the average person has about 600 lymph nodes in their body. I'm down 30, and actually I'm down 50 because I had 20 removed 3 years ago in a similar surgery. But this extra cancer, in essence, or more cancer than I thought, was a little bit of a shock to me, and it was more than what we expected. And I've got a picture here just to kind of show you what I had to go through. So if you're a little squeamish, look away, or maybe it was too late and you caught it and you can't look away. Yeah, that's me. I look like Frankenstein. I look like I had my head chopped off. But the good news is that I'm recovering really well. And it's going well. I'm healing up nicely. I won't pull my shirt down to show you, but just take my word for it. I still have some issues with some nerve issues in my neck, and I'll be starting physio this week to deal with muscle issues in my shoulder, and hopefully I can get back to normal really quick. So what's next? In February, I'll actually be meeting with my oncologist, and I already know, we've already had a phone call, but I'll be meeting with him in person to kind of plan out the next steps. And basically, he's recommending that I do another round of radioactive iodine radiation. And this would be my third round going into it, and this potentially would take place at the beginning of March. So I still have a number of things that I have to go through and do. And so I just want to thank everyone who's been praying for me. I thank you for those of you who've been letting me know that you've been praying for me. I really appreciate it. My family really appreciates it. And to be honest, I've had incredible peace through this entire time. So thank you. And I think a big part of that is because of the prayers that you have been offering up on my behalf and my family's behalf. And so I just ask that you keep praying for me. And there's 3 things that you could do to keep praying for. The first one is this, that in my recovery, that my energy would come back. I still don't have my full energy. I still struggle with it a little bit. So you can pray for my energy levels. Second, you can pray for healing. I don't want to not ask for healing. So God says sometimes we don't get because we don't ask. So you can pray that I would be completely healed of whatever cancer is left in my body. And then third, I've already done radiation twice. And here's the thing. It seems that I'm a little bit resistant to the effects of the radiation in my body, meaning that it doesn't seem to take care of the cancer in my body like it should, and it does in most other people. And now, as I've shared this with people, a number of people have been offered a couple of theories of why that's the case, why I seem to be radiation resistant. One, some people think I'm Superman, which, hey, that's not a bad thing, but I've also had other people wonder whether I was a cockroach or not. I would prefer the former over the latter, but I'll let you make up your mind on that one. But you could pray that if I don't have complete healing before March, that as I go through this third round of radiation, because potentially it's the last round I can do because I'll be close to my lifetime supply of radiation, that radiation would work, that it would seek out the cancer, that it would kill all the cancer in my body, and that I wouldn't have to then, maybe do more complicated and drastic and unpleasant things if this doesn't work. So you can pray for that. So just thank you for that. Thank you for praying. And that's kind of where I'm at. And now you know as much as I know about where I'm at. I wanted to start the message today by sharing a little lesson that I learned having to go through this recent surgery that I just did to take the cancer out of my neck. And the lesson is this: a hospital room reveals who you really are. Now, I had to stay overnight in the hospital with this last surgery, and fortunately it was just one night and I was able to leave the next afternoon, so I'm glad it was that short. But I had to share a room with 3 other people. There was 2 other guys and 1 lady, and I really felt sorry for this lady who had to share with 3 guys. But let me say this. The 2 guys that I had to share this hospital room, they were a piece of work. They were loud, they were obnoxious, and they were rude. On a scale of 1 to 10, normal conversation levels is like a 4 or a 5, right? Their normal was like 8 or 9. And which is funny because generally when you go in a hospital room, if you've ever done that, generally most people, if they're considerate, they lower their conversation level to like a 2 or a 3. So they quietly talk to the person in bed, trying not to disrupt the other person. I can't tell you how many times I got woken up by these two guys in their loud conversations. And I'm a heavy sleeper. I normally can sleep through like earthquakes. And yet these guys were so loud that I woke up so many times, and it was not good. Like, you're in the hospital bed, you want to sleep so you can recover well, right? And it wasn't just their level of conversation, it was how they treated the nurses, which was really poorly. I mean, one guy got mad at one of our nurses because he wasn't allowed to order pizza and have the delivery guy bring it up to the hospital room. But perhaps the most annoying thing that one of these guys did was he used his talk to text mode to text people. So he would speak out loud what he wanted to text instead of picking up his phone and using his thumbs and his fingers to text. And you know what? Normally, that would be okay if you were just doing a few texts, telling people how you're doing, updating people. But this guy, he was trying to sublet his rental suite to people. And so he was talking to people via text, answering questions, asking them questions, and it went on for hours. And remember, this guy's not quiet. I learned this whole history and all the things that were going on and whether he liked certain renters or not, potentially, because of this. It was so annoying. This guy had no consideration for the other people in the room. It was all about him. You see, here's what I've noticed that what will teach you when you stay in a hospital. It quickly reveals how selfish people really are. We're going to look at a couple of verses today that deal with this issue of selfishness. And they're found in Philippians chapter 2. And you can turn to Philippians chapter 2. And if you're just joining us in our Philippians series, this service, this message right now, let me just bring you up to speed. Let me set the stage for you. Paul, the apostle, is writing to a group of Christians in the city of Philippi, the Philippian church. And he's been writing to them, and in chapter 1, he's talked about how they have faced suffering, and he's encouraged them to persevere, and he gives some of his own examples of that. And in chapter 4, which we haven't gotten to yet, obviously, because we're in chapter 2, he talks about some of the divisions in the church, and chapter 2 starts with a call to unity, a call to come together and be of one mind, one spirit. And we looked at that last week. And we're going to look at verses 3 and 4 today. And I want to read, and it's a continuation of the first couple of verses of chapter 2. So remember, it's talking about unity and how we get there. And in verse 3, he says this: "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others." He's talking about how we, as a group of people who have differing opinions, differing viewpoints, can come together and be united. And he points out that unity and harmony breaks down because we have impulses to be selfish and to be conceited. Look at the two terms that he starts with in verse 3. He talks about selfish ambition and vain conceit. Selfish ambition really speaks to someone who is selfish. And it speaks to someone who is trying to advance themselves by using flattery or deceit or false accusations or even partial untruth, something to make themselves look better. You see, selfish ambition is about trying to achieve your own personal goals. And it kind of is lived out in the philosophy of the ends justify the means. So someone who has selfish ambition is willing to do kind of whatever to get what they want. Vain conceit is a way of describing how someone looks at themselves. And it means that if someone has vain conceit, they have a highly exaggerated self-view of themselves. And they're the type of person that seeks their own personal glory. So they want to look good in front of others. They try and portray the best part of themselves so that they hide other areas of their life, Instagram, to show other people the best view of themselves. They want to look good in front of others. They don't want others to see any weaknesses. And Paul calls us out of this selfishness and this conceit. And he says, don't do anything in your life that is motivated by these two motivations. Because he knows that selfishness, when left unchecked, becomes a consuming and destructive sin. You see, selfishness leads to other things. It breeds anger, it breeds resentment, and it makes us jealous. And ultimately, what selfishness does is it breaks down relationships because it is always putting ourselves before the other person. He also knows that conceit is a problem because here's one of the things that happens when someone is full of conceit. They consider themselves better than another person. They consider themselves to always be right. And they expect others to agree with them. You see, what Paul is saying here is you will never have unity or harmony in a relationship, whether it's a family or a marriage or a church, when selfishness is present. Unity and harmony are so hard to achieve, right? For any of you who are in a family or in a marriage, or even just in a friendship, unity is hard to achieve. Harmony is hard to achieve because selfishness is such a universal problem. Because here's a truth. We are all on the selfishness spectrum. We all suffer from selfishness. We are all motivated at different times because we are selfish. Let me turn over to James chapter 4. James is and keep your finger here because we'll come back to this section of James too. James asks this question in chapter 4, verse 1, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Like, why do you fight? Why do you have arguments? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire, but you do not have. An older translation says this, ends the verse this way, you want something, but you don't get it. James is telling us that the reason we have fights in our life, the reason we have disagreements in our life, come from the desires within us. It's the selfishness that drives these things in our life. You see, selfishness springs out of the sin of pride. And the sin of pride basically means this, that we put ourselves in the center of our world. When we are full of pride, we believe we are the most important person there is. We are the sun in the solar system of our relationships. That's who we are. And you see, it's not just a biblical understanding. You can see this in our modern day thinking, or maybe not so modern. The English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, back in the 1600s, argued that self-interest, or selfishness in essence, was the most fundamental human motivation. And psychologist F. Diane Barth defines selfishness this way, as having two primary pillars. On one side, there is this being concerned excessively or exclusively with oneself. And then on the other side, having no regard for the needs or feelings of others. See, the Bible tells us that selfishness is natural to us because we're all sinners. We don't have to discover it. It's just part of how we naturally operate. And anyone who has been a parent or anyone who has worked with kids knows this to be true. You see, I think children are really just little bundles of selfishness that run around. And yes, even the sweet ones, because the sweet ones have just found a way to get what they want without throwing a tantrum. They're smart. But children are selfish. James, if you look back in chapter 3, verses 14, says this about selfishness, and James uses the word selfish ambition like Paul did. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom, and there's quotes, like it's air quotes, wisdom does not come from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Did you catch what James is saying there? Selfishness, if not dealt with, leads not to unity, but to disorder. And actually is a gateway sin to all the other sins, every evil practice. Meaning that if you don't deal with the selfishness in your life, it will lead you into other sins. It will lead you into more sins. It's interesting to watch someone, especially an adult, who is selfish. And as I've observed selfish adults, I've observed that their selfishness usually is a result of one of two things. The first thing is immaturity. Selfish adults are usually selfish in part because they're immature adults. The other cause for selfishness is pain, which is an interesting thing. And something that I kind of went through with this surgery. I was in a lot of pain. And when I got home and had to recover on the couch or in my bed, my world got very small and it was very focused on myself. And in many ways, rightly so. I'm trying to recover. I'm trying to get healthy again. But I'm not helping Pam out in any way. I am sitting on the couch hoping that she's bringing me a glass of water or my pain medication or bringing me some food. I am not preparing. I'm not looking after myself in any way. I'm just existing. I'm watching TV. And pain naturally causes us to become very self-focused, very self-centered, very selfish. And as I said, when we suffer in pain, there's a purpose to that. We need to focus on ourselves so that we can get better. The problem comes is that when we have pain in our life that we don't actually work through or we don't get healed from or we don't find freedom from, then that selfishness is not a short-term limited thing because we're centered on our recovery. It becomes a lifestyle. And so often what you find selfish adults are adults who have gone through some pain in their life. Maybe it was a child and they were abused. Or maybe it's some painful circumstance where it's divorce or a loss of a relationship or a discouragement because they're not accomplishing what they want to accomplish. Pain can come in a variety of forms. But if we don't deal with that pain, if we don't use those moments of pain to then become healthy, what happens is we become very inward focused, very self-centered focused, and we become selfish. The other cause often for selfish adults is immature adults. They have never gone through the process of maturing as a child into a teen, into young adults. Parents, I don't know if you think about this very often, and maybe some of you are listening, you're just starting out and you've got young kids, or maybe you don't have kids yet. This is a great time to learn. Or maybe your kids are grown and this will be just a reminder of something that you realize now. Do you realize that, and this is what I believe, that one of the main roles as a parent is to help raise our immature kids into mature adults? That's one of our main roles. We are to help shape a child and help them to grow out of their immaturity so that they can function in this world as mature adults. And so that means as parents, we need to discipline them. We need to encourage them. We need to point out when they're being selfish. Do you realize, parents, that one of the greatest ways that you can help your child not be selfish is to give them a sibling? It's a natural crucible when you have more than one child where they have to fight over stuff and learn to live together and learn to give and take and help another child or another sibling out. It's a great way for a child to mature. Great way for a child to learn that there's someone in this world beside themselves. And I don't say that for those of you who struggle to have kids and maybe can only have one. It's not to put that down. It's just a reality. And so as a parent, if you have a single child, you have actually a more difficult role and a more difficult job. You've got to step in greater ways to make sure that your child is maturing. And one of the other ways as a parent to help our child become mature is to provide that safe place for them. As a parent, it's on us to provide a safe environment for our child to explore, to grow. And oftentimes, an adult who's been hurt has grown up in a home where that safe place has not been provided. And so they are a step behind. They are way behind other children who grow up in loving homes where there's safety there. And they have to go through other things to come to a place where they can find freedom from those hurts and those pains. And sometimes our parents don't do a great job of helping us mature. And so we are reliant on others to help us walk through that. That's why discipleship is so important in the church. You see, one of the aspects of discipleship is having and working alongside others so that they can speak into our lives, so that they can be the ones who can say, hey, I think you're being a little selfish here. Or I think that's not a way a mature person operates. Because here's the thing. Selfish people often don't even know when they're being selfish. Do you realize that? Your child oftentimes, until you teach them what it is to be selfish, just thinks that the way they're operating is normal and healthy and good for them. Selfish people often don't know that they're being selfish. In 2020, a study was published in the journal Nature Communication, and it was a study done by Yale University and the University of Zurich. And what this study found was this: selfish people make adaptations to their memories to avoid feeling bad about their egotistical behavior. The research revealed that people tend to remember themselves better to others than they actually were. As Molly Crockett, the lead researcher, says this: when people behave in ways that fall short of their personal standards, one way they maintain their moral self-image is by misremembering their ethical lapses. Meaning that selfish people actually rewire their memories to think that they are better than what they were. What this means is that we lie to ourselves about our selfishness. And we actually need others to point out the selfishness in our life. That's why marriages make great discipleship grounds. You know, who's better to point out the selfishness in your life than your spouse? Right now, just don't point fingers right now, right? Because remember, when you point one finger to someone, there's three pointing back at you. Yeah. We each need to learn the lesson and hear this aspect, this truth about selfishness. We are really blind to our own selfishness. And as Christians, we see discipleship as something that helps us move past our selfishness. And so not only do we have other Christians who help point that out in our life, hopefully with love, not just truth, but we also have the Holy Spirit within us that helps remind us and point us out. And God's Word reminds us and points out that we are to have not an attitude of selfishness, but an attitude of love. So what do we do about this? The first thing we need to do and understand is we need to acknowledge that sin is a problem in our life. Sin is the root of all our problems. And it starts with our separation from God. Sin separates us from God. And sin causes all the problems we face in our life. But the good news of the gospel, the good news of Jesus is this: that God loved you so much that He sent His Son to die for you. And why would Jesus have to die for you? Because do you realize that in order to find forgiveness from your sin to God, God requires a sacrifice. And Jesus was that sacrifice for you. Do you know that whenever you sin, even if it's against another person, what the Bible tells us is that you also sin against God. So every sin you commit is not just against other people, but it's also a sin against God. And when you come to the place where you can accept and recognize this truth, you come to the place where you realize that you need Jesus. You need Jesus more than anything in the world. And if you can come to the place where you realize that you're a sinner and you're in need of what Jesus has done for you, you can enter into God's presence by confessing your sin and accepting Jesus as your Savior, the one who can save you from your sin. And what this means practically is that when you get to that position, when you get to understand this, when you come to this place where you actually believe this, what ends up happening is you end up putting Jesus at the center of your life. You remove yourself off the throne of your life and you put Jesus on the throne of your life. You put Jesus at the center. And you see, the Christian message is this. It's about falling in love with Jesus and accepting what he's done for you, and then ordering your life in the way Jesus calls you to order your life. You see, when you put Jesus at the center of your life, it allows you to become focused on others in a way you've never been able to be focused on before. Because if you're always at the center of your life, if you're always on the throne, if you're always in control of your decision makings and just going with what you feel and what you want, it's hard to put others first. And so as Christians, when we put Jesus at the center of our life, we come to the place where we realize that someone else is more important than us. And if you have come to that place where you have put Jesus at the center of life, you can then move on to what Paul calls us to in the rest of these verses 3 and 4 of Philippians chapter 2. What does he say in the rest of the verse? He calls us to put away selfish ambition and vain conceit, and he tells us to step into humility. And humility is valuing others above yourself. Here's the thing. I don't think it is possible to value others more than yourself, the way that Paul calls us to, if I am still the center of my life. It's not until we're willing to put Jesus at the center that we're able to do this. You see, Jesus asks us, when we put him in the center of our life, Jesus asks us to become like him. One of the places in the Bible that Jesus actually describes himself is in Matthew chapter 11. And he describes himself as gentle and humble in heart. And humility comes out of that humbleness of heart. And so what Paul is asking us to do is really become more like Jesus. Really to become who Jesus is calling us to become. To value humility, and we express it by valuing others more than ourselves. And then the second thing he tells us to do is to look to the interests of others ahead of your own interests. And this is what Jesus says in the New Testament. If we love him, we will obey his commands. And what are his commands? To love God and to love others. And this is basically what Paul is saying. If Paul is saying is the way to love others is to put their interests ahead of your own. And so that means our time, our money, our emotional energy, the things we value, we need to be generous with those things with other people. That's how we put others ahead of ourselves. That's how we put others' interests ahead of ourselves. I mean, how do you put your spouse first? What are the things that you do that signal to your spouse that their interests, the things that are important to them, are also important to you and maybe more important to you? Kids, how do you put your parents first? I know we grew up in a culture that says, parents, put your kids first. But kids, you're reading this. How do you put your parents first? I mean, are you sitting on the couch while they're making dinner? I'm not sure this is living out this verse, right? Are you getting up from the table and just walking away and not helping clean up the dishes or put away all the food from dinner? How are you living your life that shows that you're willing to put the needs of your parents first as well? When was the last time you gave up something for someone else? You gave up a slot in your calendar. You gave up some money that you had earmarked for something you wanted. You gave up, a priority, a movie you wanted to watch so someone else could watch something they wanted to, or do something they want to do that you don't really care about. In little ways, we need to find ways to put others first. I was reminded of this last week as we took the Lord's Supper in a funny way. I don't know if you watch, but on the screen when we do the Lord's Supper, we put up the Lord's Supper and there's an image and then there's these small words, the bread is gluten-free. You see, a number of years ago, we started bringing out, gluten-free bread. So you had an option. If you're gluten-free, you could take the gluten-free, and it was a small little tray, and it was kind of like we segregated the gluten-free people off to the side. They could take from their own special tray. And then a couple of years ago, we made the switch to change all the bread to gluten-free bread. So that when someone who was gluten-free came up, no one had to know that they were gluten-free. They could just take the bread like everyone else. You know what? I'm not gluten-free. And to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of gluten-free bread. But it's important to put the interests of others first. And we have to find ways to show that. And one of the ways we actually do that as a church, and you might find this insignificant or inconsequential, but it is a way that we do this, is through the Lord's Supper. The picture of coming together and being unified as the body. What better time to put aside our preferences, sweet tasting bread, to be able to come together and eat the same loaf. What a beautiful picture. You know what? Paul says that unity is actually possible in this passage. But it first requires that we give up our selfish ways and that we end up focusing on the value of others and their interests. And I'm not sure there's a more important message that we need to hear today in the climate that we live, that unity is possible, but it first requires us not to be selfish and to look out and value others. Let me pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you for this message from Philippians chapter 2. I thank you for the reminder that we are selfish and that's something we need to pay attention to. And so, Lord, I pray as people are listening to this, that your Spirit would speak to them and point out in the areas of their life where they are being selfish. Lord, help them to commit to living this way in their relationships, and whether it's with their spouse or their family or their friends or people at the church. Lord, help them to come into these relationships with an attitude of humility, willing to put aside their preferences and the things they want in order to have that unity and harmony. And Lord, may we be a church that is a witness to our community, because this is true of us, that we are united and that there is harmony in our midst. In Jesus' name, amen.